Hello. So this presentation is for the Curriculum Development and Instruction Master's Program Class 506, and specifically for the assignment titled Best Practices for Nurturing Intellectual Competencies. So to start off, when thinking on the aspects of nurturing the intellectual competencies for children in schools, there are several important factors that need to be considered. First, it's necessary to look at the child as a whole and not just simply at the behaviors that they are overtly displaying or at just simply the work they are producing or not producing. One must also understand that each child is unique in and of themselves, and while they may fall under a specific guise or a specific learning group, it's important to be aware that that doesn't necessarily define the child in its, fullest extent. And to think of it in those terms is extremely limiting. So in this presentation, our learning group is examining 4 different learning groups in schools. And this is how we've broken it down. So Joe is examining special education. Candy is looking at children who live in poverty and the inner city. Adriana is delving into English language learners, and I myself am looking at students who are qualified as gifted and or talented. We're looking at each of these groups individually from our own perspectives and basing them off of what we have observed either at our own school site or a school or schools in our specific area. So here we go.
Children with learning disabilities are a heterogeneous group. These children are a diverse group of individuals exhibiting potential difficulties in many different areas.
Throughout the years, there's been a wide variety of characteristics,
like hyperactivity or impulsivity, perceptual motor or disorders of memory, attention or neurological signs, emotional or academic difficulties.
One theory that draws on both cognitive and behavior influences and benefits from technology is that of social learning or social cognitive theory. As for curriculum, differentiation includes delivering the materials to each style: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. Poverty in education is all too well known throughout the country. Students are normally plagued by social economic issues in their community. Most parents are single with stories of horror as to why the situation has been brought to them. As an educator, we can assist with the facilitation of a more conducive environment, not only in education, but create a sense of security for the child's confidence, creating the most open dialogue for the students to feel wanted and needed and have the ability to learn from you, the educator, and take lessons from them. Students need validation to create and maintain relationships, laying the foundation for socialization. After a relationship has been established, the attention moves to believing. The school that is being identified is Edward Robal High School in downtown Los Angeles, California. The class is called Language and Literacy and is a mix of 9th through 12th graders, including some special education students. The purpose of this class is to prepare students to redesignate from English language learners to English proficient. The main challenges in teaching in that classroom variety is very diverse, with students speaking multiple languages. Some of those languages may include Mandarin, Cantonese, Spanish, and English. Some students have behavioral issues as well, while others are diagnosed with a disability. Some of the learning characteristics include following along in class and participating. There are some students that display inability to follow along due to comprehension and prefer to speak their own language. In regards to curriculum, there is a literacy coach who comes into the classroom twice a week to assist in curriculum design. Some of the lessons could include daily agendas to practice good organization or using 3D notebooks, reading novels to help build vocabulary, sentence fluency, and listening skills.
So as important as it is to nurture and support students who would qualify for special education, students who classify as English language learners, and students who live in poverty, it's equally important to support students who fall under the category of gifted and talented. Before we begin, though, I would like to re-mention something that I talked about in the introduction, that a student doesn't neatly fall into these labels, and to think in those terms is very limiting. So it's important to recognize that students aren't just necessarily one thing or the other. So for example, a child could qualify for special education and be considered gifted as well. So as far as my school site goes, I live in a rural town at the base of the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains. Our valley in its entirety has a population of about 20,000 people. And while we don't have a whole lot of diversity, we do have some. About 20% of our students are Native American, 30% are Hispanic, and the remainder would be considered white or non-Hispanic. Now, while our school site does do an excellent job of supporting their teachers, I really feel like we could be doing a better job of supporting our students. One way that I feel personally limited is that I am the only 7th grade language arts teacher in my district, and it would be wonderful to have another teacher who teaches the exact same thing as me to bounce ideas off of and to truly create a professional learning community with. So that's one way that I feel limited, and I feel like I have to go outside of my own district on my own time to find people to collaborate with. So I feel like if I had another person, it would be a lot easier. So as far as focusing on gifted and talented students go, they have several characteristics, and these are just a few that I have noticed from my students who fall into that realm at my school site. So many of them are rapid learners. They easily pick up skills and new information. They retain information remarkably well. They oftentimes have excellent memories. They are natural problem solvers and are able to think more abstractly than many of the other students in my class. So thinking on those qualities and those characteristics and determining how to differentiate curriculum for them, there are 3 specific ways that I'm going to mention right now. I do more than these 3 ways, but these are just 3 examples of things that I'm doing right now for these students. So for example, when we are studying vocabulary, let's say before we're reading a story, and I want them to go in with a working knowledge of some of the vocabulary words they're going to come across, I will look at the complexity of the words, and I will tend to give those students who have greater critical thinking skills more complex, more challenging words. The expectations of the assignment are always the same for everybody. I don't give more work to one group than I do to another, but simply giving them a more challenging word kind of allows them to delve into those greater critical thinking skills that they possess. In a similar sense, with my novels, I always like to do accompanying short stories, articles, and poetry. So if I was going to provide poetry or a couple of poems to go along with the text, in the same sense of how I would do the vocabulary, I'd also do the poetry similarly, where I would give students, my gifted and talented students, a more complex poem to analyze, to look at, to compare, so that they are able to think more abstractly about the topic than, say, a student who is a more who struggles with reading more. And then the last way I've differentiated, and I just did this, was after we read the book The Outsiders. I had students write a response to literature paper, and I gave 2 prompts. So one prompt was on choosing a character that they felt was the most heroic and supporting that with evidence from the text. I gave that to students who didn't necessarily have as great capacity, who weren't as proficient writers. And then to my more proficient writers, my students who think more critically, who are gifted and talented, I gave them a prompt where they had to choose a character that had transformed the most from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. And so looking at character development is a greater skill than just picking a character trait and supporting it with evidence from the text. So those are 3 examples of differentiation. So whether the child qualifies for special education, is an English language learner, comes from poverty, or is considered gifted and or talented, it is incredibly important to understand the characteristics of each of those groups, and equally as important to understand the child as an individual whole, so that you can differentiate classroom instruction and curriculum appropriately for them.